Okay, let me just check my device here. Hoping I have sound coming through for you. We're starting right now, and I want to welcome you to the broadcast. Just maybe let me know if you can hear me, and let me know if you can see me as well, and we'll get started. Hi everybody, I'm Angela Fehr. Today I'm excited to be wrapping up a little series on painting loose florals in watercolor, and I've had a lot of fun sharing this series of classes, these free video lessons that I do here live on YouTube. And we're going to move over to my painting surface in just a minute. I just want to look back a little bit over the last couple of weeks. We started out painting a loose wash, just a first wet and wet wash in watercolor. And then going from there, we were thinking flowers. We already had a composition in our mind before we started painting, and I always think that's a really good idea to have a little bit of a direction you want to go in. And yet with watercolor, especially loose painting in watercolor, you also want to be flexible. You want to be willing to adapt your plan depending on what's happening on the paper. So we talked about that. And hi Joe, thank you for joining us. I see our moderator Joe is here, and he's going to field some of your questions and write them down as they come up, and then I'll try to address them as well at the end of the class. I want to welcome you here today. We're going to move on into just talking about that feeling of being stalled out in your floral painting, because when we are painting loose florals, there's a little bit of planning that goes into our early layers, and then there's also a lot of reacting, looking at what's happening on the paper and making kind of adapting our plan as we go along. We in last week's lesson, we actually started, we paused in between our first wash lesson and our detail lesson and looked at focusing on basic shapes, and really good shapes, good composition is the foundation of all painting. And seeing the major shapes in the elements that you're painting really help you to get have it all come together in your painting, give you a good foundation, and then building out the detail from there. And with loose painting, we don't always need a lot of detail. And we looked at that last week as we started to add detail slowly and cautiously to our painting. And I say slowly and cautiously because I think it's really a good idea to have a plan in your mind, observe, react, and pause and plan again. So we're going to talk right now about that feeling of being stalled out. You've started working on your loose floral, you've added some detail, and then you hit a wall. You don't know what to do next. And again, it's really good to take breaks, paint in short spurts, and then you get that chance to walk away and look at your painting with fresh eyes. One of my students on my Facebook group, and I encourage you to join my Angela Fehr Watercolor Workshop Facebook group, where you can share your art with other watercolor lovers. And one of the students had posted a painting that she had done, and then in the comments a few hours later she posted a second version. She said, as soon as I saw it on the computer, once I took a picture of it, I saw it needed some darks in these critical areas, and so she was able to better analyze what her painting needed just by that act of taking a picture and seeing it a little bit smaller on the screen. And it happens like that for me all the time, seeing my painting just in a new light, whether it's just after a day has passed and you're looking at it with fresh eyes. Maybe you turn it upside down, maybe you photograph it and look at it on a small screen, or maybe you photograph it and look at it in black and white. Those can all be really helpful ways to analyze your painting and kind of see its weaknesses and what you need to add. Another artist I know uses a mirror and looks at their painting, his painting in a mirror, in order to kind of analyze what's going on there. So those are all things you can do to improve your, or to not improve, to come out of that stalled place. And I think another thing that can help you if you're feeling stalled is just going over the different techniques that you can use to develop your painting. So we're going to look at those today. And I'm excited to share these because I started writing down a list of of different techniques that I use when I'm painting and adding those details into my painting. And I'm excited to be sharing 6 techniques with you. I thought I just had 5, and then I thought of another one today. So we're going to go into that and look at those. And so we're going to move over here and get set up. Before we do that, I do want to give you a little bit of housekeeping. If you haven't been here before, and I see people checking in from all over the place, so welcome. But if you haven't been to my live lesson before, one thing you're going to want to know is that in the video description below this lesson, don't leave without taking a look at that, because I share my supplies that I've used and links, so if you have something you just have to purchase if you fall in love with the color I'm using. I also have information on my mailing list, which will keep you from missing a lesson, because I always send out a link to the lesson every week, as well as other helpful watercolor tips and things to encourage you. And as well there, I have a link to my watercolor workshop, which is taking place in my home studio this summer. If you are anywhere within traveling distance of British Columbia, northern British Columbia, where I live, you are welcome to join me in my studio this July for a 2-day watercolor workshop. I do have some other workshops in the works. I am hoping to do a November workshop in Vancouver, BC. And I'm in very exciting talks about doing a travel destination workshop in somewhere in Europe in September of 2018. I don't want to give away all the details yet, but as soon as I have them in a way I can present them to you, you will hear about them. So those are some things I'm excited about. I love teaching you here online, but of course it's always really rewarding to get to meet people and work with you personally. So if you have the chance and would love to work with me, take a look at my website. I always have links to my most current workshop schedule and everything that's available there. So okay, I'm going to move my camera, and while I'm doing that, I'm going to switch my camera over to this, let's see here, there we go, this painting here, and this is by one of my online students, Fehr, and she's was following along with our live video lessons, and as you can see, she's made her own interpretation, which I'm really excited about, because well, you can just see how lovely it is. She's managed to keep that balance of simplicity and detail that I think is really gorgeous, and her own little touches of her own brush style, brush handling and style are in there as well. So that's the goal, is not just to paint like me, but to paint like you, and like that little voice in your heart says you want to paint. And it takes time to develop that. And it involves building skill, but also just learning how to kind of listen to your heart a little bit. So now we're going to just move over to my work surface, and I've zoomed right in on my painting, on my paper today, because we're going to, since we're talking about techniques, we really want to have a really good close-up look at technique here. And I will move my palettes over so you can maybe see a little bit of my process. I always have my water kind of up in front of me here, and I always keep 2 waters, and you guys know that's because I use one to clean my brush and I use one for clean water for mixing. So I always have a clean brush when I'm painting. And let's take a look here. I'm going to also, I haven't moistened my palette yet. I always like to spritz it with water. And that loosens up the pigment on the top layer of my palette, makes it a lot easier to grab pigment. So we're just going to talk again about the different techniques you can use as you develop your painting. And in this series, as I've worked on this painting, you have seen me use a number of these techniques already. So we'll talk about some of them and I'll demonstrate others. And of course, the first technique that we used was wet and wet. Wetting down our paper, dropping in that color and letting it flow. And I don't always paint strictly wet and wet. This is just a scrap of paper here with a little bit of color on it already. I've been waiting for something to appear out of those kind of loose shapes. But often I'll start painting with dry paper, and I'll start laying my paint down. This is Lavender by Daniel Smith. and it's pretty pale. So that means I can use it fairly saturated. But often I'll start with a very moist brush and dropping in that color. I end up with a wet and wet effect, but because I've started on dry paper, I'm giving that color, I have a little bit more control, I guess is where I'm going with that. And if I ramble sometimes, it's really hard to talk and paint. Some days my concentration's just not there as I try to explain my process. Adding a little bit of, I believe this is raw sienna. So starting on dry paper, but I get the wet and wet effect because I just keep adding water and pigment and getting some beautiful color. I've added now the lavender. This is Sleeping Beauty Turquoise. Cobalt Violet is very similar. Or not Cobalt Violet, Cobalt Teal. Cobalt Violet is this violet over that I placed in the corner, which is one of my favorite colors to use because it's pale and it has this beautiful texture that I think you should be able to see. And Cobalt Violet and Cobalt Teal really play beautifully together. So you get a lot of little fun effects working wet and wet. This is this kind of technique that you use at the beginning of a painting because there's not a lot of control there. Things are flowing and moving. And so we use the more uncontrolled techniques at the beginning of our painting process. Moving back to here, we also can do a very small scale wet and wet technique. And this is what you would do in this detail stage. You can take the wet and wet technique and you can do it on a smaller scale. So maybe that means you, in your painting, you have an area where you want to add some color. And I think we're going to go over here. I kind of feel like this daffodil should have a little bit of an edge on this side. So I can wet this area, painting around the daffodil, and then I can dot in the color. And that's a very, very pale rose madder permanent. And I'm going to get a wet and wet look, but just in this very small area. Grab a little bit of, this is Wisteria, another new color by Daniel Smith. And I'm kind of going to pull it over into this pink area, I think. Just blending a little bit. And loving the transparency of watercolor, which allows us to layer color and not lose what was already there. We're adding to it. And I like using, you can use a wet and wet technique if you're actually, here I used it to paint around the daffodil, but you can also use it to paint actual flowers. And in my local class that I did last night, we actually, I can do it on here, we actually painted our petals one at a time. So I would moisten one petal area. And I know a lot of you saw a lamb in this little wet wash, but I still see flowers. I don't want to paint lambs. But I can moisten that one area, I can touch in my color, and you can see that beautiful flow as the color bleeds into that moist area. So I'm getting the looseness of wet and wet, but the control of working with it in just a smaller area. And that little dot of lavender is quite dominant there. Give it a little movement and then it'll bleed into the rest of the colors there. And then I move through the painting and I can do those little wet and wet petals just one at a time. So if you like wet and wet, but you hate that feeling of having absolutely no control, you know, do a little controlled wet and wet. Work in a small area, and you can have that beautiful, fresh, fluid color in very small doses. Of course, now that I've done these two petals, they're across from each other. They're not going to bleed into each other. If I were to do a petal right here, then everything would start to bleed together and my wet and wet area gets larger. So I let this dry. I move over here maybe and work on a petal over in this area. And come back to this area once it's dry and I can do the rest of the petals. And they won't bleed together. So that's one way to use wet and wet, just on a small scale. A lot of what I do when I'm starting to add details here, and a lot of what you're probably going to enjoy as you develop your watercolor skills, is painting wet on dry. And I think we're going to do some leaves this time. Grabbing the Cobalt Teal. And there's Cobalt Teal in this area already, so by using it in other parts of my painting, I have that beautiful continuity. And let's move up to, well, let's do it down here actually. So painting wet on dry, anytime you're painting with your brush and you've got moist pigment on dry paper, the pigment basically stays where you put it. And so we get a nice crisp line. And so this is where we start to be able to add details and define shapes just by choosing a color and then adding, creating those brush strokes, we get our crisp lines. But personally, I find that very defined shapes can be also a little bit dull. So that's when we get to do variations on wet on dry. So often I'll paint that first line, and I'm going to use a darker color this time. Let's go with the Undersea green. And so I might start by painting that first line. You can see it stands out a little bit here. And it's crisp on this side because I have dry paper on this side. On this side, I'd already put that line of Cobalt Teal, so you can see it start to bleed. And I can use that to my advantage, knowing that with a damp brush, I can soften one side of my leaf shape. And so my brush is damp right now. It's not putting a lot of moisture on the paper, but it's just creating a nice soft area for that color to smoothly flow. I can do the same over here. And I might go right up against that pink petal. That'll make that pink flower just kind of pop. And then I can pull that Undersea green down. And already it's bleeding because I have that moisture there, that original line of Cobalt Teal that I placed. So I'm getting a wet on dry. I've got a crisp edge on one side and a soft edge on the other. Adding a little water on this side can give me some variation as well. I feel like this is too crisp, so then I soften, use some water to move that color. As you add water, the color gets lighter because I'm spreading that pigment across the page, so there's less of it to cover any one area. And I'm also getting a softer edge, which I think a little bit of interplay, hard and soft edges, is very interesting to look at. So I put a little bit of a soft edge there too. So now we've got crisp and softness happening in the same area. Wet and dry gives you that opportunity again to play with wet and wet. I placed color on a moist area, but having the dryness gives you that control where you get to create some lines and edges. And you can use it for negative painting where you're painting around an object, or you can use it for positive effects where you're painting the object itself, like I did over here. Now I want to go with a few kind of more creative elements, a little bit of outside the box. And we're not even going to talk about texture effects like salt, but we are going to look at some spatter. And I love spatter because it gives you that opportunity to give a little wild abandon a little later in the painting process. And I've already got some spatter over here. You can see those little blobs of color. And I think the key here with spatter is you want to work pale at this stage of the painting. You don't want your spattered color to dominate and be too bold. So I'm going to use a pale color. I'm going to use the lavender again, and I'm going to add it kind of over here. And right now I'm just using my Escoda Versatile. This is my favorite brush. And you can see it's giving a nice little fine mist. Now I'm going to risk actually wrecking this painting to show you guys some different techniques. So I'm going to try a juicier brush and we'll see what we get. So this time I've got my brush very saturated. If I shake it at all, it's going to blob. So if I spatter, am I going to get a bigger droplets. They're still not too bad actually. So they're still fairly small in size. If I were to change brushes, and this is a Princeton Neptune number 4 quill brush. I love it because it's got those little wires that hold the bristles onto the ferrule. And it holds a ton of water. This brush is just a thirsty beast. So I'm gonna tweak my color a little bit because it's getting a little boring with just Wisteria over there. So let's add some pink to it. Got some opera pink right here. So we're gonna have a pinkier spatter, and I think I might actually move into this area so that we don't just have one area with spatter. So I'll move things over a little bit. So this brush, because it holds more liquid, I'm getting bigger blobs of color. And then how I flick it is going to make a difference too. I don't need to touch the bristles in order to get that spatter. I'm just tapping it against my hand. You can choose to cover the parts of your painting that you don't want to have get spattered. That's often a good idea if you have especially really pale areas that you want to keep light. Now often when I've spattered like this, oh, and I have one more tool to spatter with, and that's my toothbrush. And I'm going to add some Cobalt Teal this time to my mixture. And sometimes I will scrub this brush right into the paint. You'll get a much brighter, dark, or more opaque spatter then. Right now I'm using a more watery combination. And this will give a very fine spray. The toothbrush is the most delicate spray and I do have to use my hand to get it to spatter. So that gives you another kind of spatter. And right now it's looking very busy. All that spray is starting to dominate. And so often what I'll do is after I've spattered, I like to take my brush, a little bit juicy with pigment, and start to lighten some of those areas. And I'm just actually tapping my brush into some of those moist spatter areas and adding a little water. Some of those little spatter bits will bleed together. And because I'm adding water, the color is going to be a little paler too. And you can also take a spray bottle and just mist it lightly, and that will really diffuse the spatter. But I like using my brush just because I get a little bit more control over how I'm going to diffuse it. And here it's actually some of these bigger pink spray bits are almost touching each other to begin with. So adding water to them, it really gives them that chance to kind of flow into each other. And this is actually a really good way to create tiny blossoms. Right now, this little pink area is starting to look like a flower maybe on a stalk. And then I can choose to work with that, reacting to what I see. I'm grabbing some green gold, and with my brush, I'm going to paint a couple little stems that are going to make it look like a stalk. And so now I'm getting the look of a little stem of blossoms. And I can add a little color to it. So the spatter gave me a direction to go. It wasn't just the only technique I used here. I'm using the spatter to guide me almost to my next move. And so now I have a little stem there. And because that worked quite well, then that gives me a direction to go here, maybe pulling another little stem towards this pink area. And now I have actual kind of a shape and unity here where several things are going on, not just one random flower by itself, because that doesn't make sense. Okay, so that's spatter, and I really do like to add water to soften that spatter. This area is going to take longer to dry. I don't know if you can see the way the droplets are just sitting. There you go, sitting on the paper. But when you have that quantity of water there, it's really interesting the way the pigment will kind of swirl. And often too, when you have a little bubble of water, the pigment will float on that water, and then it'll migrate, it'll curve down to where the water, the edge of that little bubble is. And so you'll actually get a darker edge. So if you've noticed when you're painting that often when you're painting wet and wet, around the edge of where your wet area, you're getting a darker edge, it's because you have a little, that kind of bubble of water that pushes the pigment to the edge. A little less water doesn't do it nearly as much. Okay, I have 2 more techniques to share with you, and I'm really taking my time to demonstrate them. I want you to kind of understand how I would incorporate them into my painting. I should, I'm just trying to figure out how this is going to work. Okay. Another technique that I use that I like is just working with line. And this is something I would save till toward the end of my painting. And sometimes you'll have an area that you want to define a little bit, you want it to stand out, but you don't want to, I don't know, whatever you've been doing, you don't want to build it up with a lot more layers of color. And I think that's the problem. If you build up too much color, you're going to start to run the risk of your color getting a little bit muddy. The more colors I lay over this soft pink area, the more likely I might choose a color that has a little complementary hue in it. If it's got a little bit of green, you're going to get a little bit of dullness, and then you start to lose the freshness. So if I don't want that to happen, sometimes all I need to do is just think in terms of adding a few little lines. So maybe it would just be a matter of, kind of painting some line. And it gives your painting sometimes a little bit of a graphic element, illustrative maybe feeling. Because so often in watercolor, we're painting these larger shapes and we don't think a lot in line. We can sometimes use those lines to guide us, and right now I'm just actually softening some of those lines. So I've got a combination of line and soft flowing color, and it starts to build up the shape of that flower. Ooh, and that's really bright. And that's the Pure Rose Madder Permanent. And oh, I like that actually. I often will use line towards the end of my painting to add a little detail to the leaves or to paint a vine or two. So it might be a matter of taking that line and creating some veins here in this leaf. This leaf could have a vein. We might want a stem or two just coming down. And of course, using the side of your brush, you're going to get a wider line. It doesn't have to be a really thin line. And this is the technique you use at the very end of your painting, because you want to have that crispness and you want it to last. I might decide to take a little, oh, and it's moist there, so it's not going to stay. But you might decide to take and fill in the center of your flower with some little dots of pollen and just blob a little bit of color in. And so line isn't just lines, it can be little dots and speckles and freckles in your painting as well. And that's pretty straightforward. And finally, the last technique that I was going to share with you, and it was one I had forgotten about until I really started thinking about this class and using different techniques. And this is called, I think of it as washing color or channeling color away. And what often will happen, especially as you're building up detail and making things stand out in your painting, is you might put down a color that's just a little darker than you want. So I'm going to choose, I'm going to have to take a big risk and add a really bold color here to really show you guys what I mean. So I'm going to use the Ultramarine Turquoise and a little bit of Dioxazine Violet, and I'm going to go right in here. Move up so you can see and try not to spill my water. So I'm going in with quite a bold color. And this whole technique came about because I placed some color that was too dark, and then I panicked and knew I didn't want it there. And that's going to happen sometimes. And it led the way for me realizing there's a whole beautiful technique that you can use when you've placed color that's too dark. So we just did a little wet on dry painting, this shape here, and it's just very dark and very, very bold. And my cell phone's going off. We're just going to ignore it. And what you want to do, I'm still just going to wait for my phone to stop ringing. Yeah, and that's a ringtone I always hear. So does everyone else. Okay, so when I place a color that's a bit too dark, often what we'll do is we'll panic and go to blot it up with a paper towel. And what I've found works almost better sometimes, especially if you're working on a background area, is adding water and letting that color flow. And it works really well on good quality paper and with the beautiful sedimentary pigment that kind of sits on the surface of the paper and doesn't stain. And I can just start adding water, and that water creates channels. It flows the pigment. It gives a little current for that pigment to flow away from the place I originally placed it. And as I let it trickle down, the excess pigment, the pigment that's sitting on top, flows down with the water to the edge of the paper, which then I can lift it with a thirsty brush and take away that excess pigment. And what happens then is, instead of getting an ugly, I shouldn't say ugly, instead of getting, if you'd taken a paper towel and lifted some of that color, you'd probably get it lighter than it was, because it was too dark, and you'd get it as light as you wanted, but you'd also get it looking kind of interfered with, because you're blotting the paper, you're kind of mashing some pigment into the paper, scrubbing a little bit, and so you kind of lose some freshness as you blot or lightly rub your paper. And so by adding water and letting the water do the work of flowing that excess pigment away, you get a much softer, fresher look. And the color that's underneath is showing through. I haven't lifted away the underneath pigment, the stuff that had dried in the first layer. And so I get a really beautiful effect. And you can actually place color that's quite dark and then add a little rivulet of water that creates a channel through that dark pigment. You don't have to wash it all away. And it's a technique that I love to use because it works with the natural tendency of water. Water as a current, it moves things. And so letting the water move your pigment, instead of you forcing it with your brush or with your paper towel, lifting it off, you get a much more natural effect, and one that's a lot prettier and fresher in my mind. And now that this area is all completely wet, nice and moist, I can add color to it as well and enhance some of those areas. As the pigment has flowed away, I feel like it needs a little bit more continuity of color from this area moving down into here. So I'm touching it in with some Cobalt Teal. Okay, so those are 6 different techniques that I use as I go through the process of developing my paintings. What I would remind you is keep things light, don't go too dark too fast, and we can always build up darker color. And if you need to flow it away, that's where we add a little more water and let things move across the page. And I really love seeing a painting come to life as we explore some of these different techniques. Because this painting has kind of turned into a tutorial, it's a little bit all over the place. There's not a lot of kind of continuity, and that's another thing that I look for as I develop my painting, is to have some flow, elements that are connected and feel like they fit together. And so I don't think this painting is a complete and total loss or anything, but it takes time and observation and that willingness to kind of work with the painting to find a way to make all the different elements work together. And I like to try to move out from that central area and build things up to enhance and add to the painting. Remember that if you're not adding to your painting, you're taking away from it. So don't just paint aimlessly, but have a plan in your mind. Paint as far as your plan goes, then take a break and then plan again. And that will help you in that process of adding what your painting needs and responding to what you see there. I'm going to move over to the comments and take a look at your questions. So just bear with me for a moment as I move the camera. Okay, so we're going to move to your questions, and I'm feeling pretty good about the techniques I shared today. They really are basically what I use in the process of painting. And with watercolor, there's not a ton of techniques, but it's knowing when to use them and how to use them that will just make you a better painter. Let's take a look here. Comment, Leslie says, I need to use more water. Joe says, flow is all about being liberal with your water. It really is. A lot of times watercolorists, especially when you're getting started, you just don't use enough water. And so I like to think of things as being juicy. You don't want big puddles most of the time. And I did work a little bit with some puddles of color, but most of the time you're looking for kind of a juicy, shiny effect. And paying attention to the areas that start to, your painting isn't always going to dry evenly, so you have to pay attention to the parts that are drying faster than others. Dina asks about Wisteria, and I'll pull it over here. My problem is I have two here. I have Lavender and I have Wisteria, and I would say, and this is a beautiful palette made for me by my friend Marilyn, who's a potter. And I love using it for testing out colors, and it's going to drip if I tilt it too much. I would say the Lavender is like a periwinkle blue almost. It's a little bit more on the purple side. And the Wisteria is like a pale orchid color. If I'm buying clothes and something's listed as orchid, I expect it to be kind of that pale pinky purple. C. Wellwood asks, where in Canada can we get 300-pound paper online? I like Arches 300-pound cold press. I also like Indigo 300-pound, but it's a little bit hard to get right now as they change distributors. And so I would encourage you to check out Opus Framing in Vancouver. Curry's Art Supplies is on the Ontario side, so they're another place to check. And I also order from Delta and the Paint Spot in Edmonton, Alberta. Additional questions, just taking a look. Wayne mentions that plastic bottles with long nozzle attachments allow you to control the flow of water on your work. Yes, and I actually have a little squirt bottle that I always mean to have nearby filled with water, and I always forget, so I end up using my brush. But it is, I saw it and I thought, oh yeah, that would be a great tool. Those little bottles with the nozzles that you get when you color your hair work really well. Make sure they're really clean. Oh, where was that comment? C. Wellwood says, I am determined to get at least one wonderful watercolor picture. You can do it. Getting better as an artist really is just a matter of perseverance and practice. And I think saying, you know what, I love this too much to give up now is a really good attitude to have, because with that faith that I'm going to keep doing it and not give up, the skill develops from that. Appreciating all your comments. Joe mentions a heat gun or hair dryer. I actually don't use a heat gun or hair dryer. That's my personal preference is to wait. And the reason I wait is because I don't think that fast. I like to allow my brain the chance to catch up with my painting, basically. I say watercolor. I used to say watercolor, you have to paint fast because things dry quickly, but actually in watercolor, you want to think slow and then paint fast. Think slow, meaning have a plan, take your time and know what you're going to do, then dash in there and do it, and then stop once you paint. Don't paint past your plan. I wanted to mention as well, this is the last lesson in our floral series. I'm going to move on to something else next week, but if you really haven't had enough, if you feel like there's more you need to know, these free lessons are just a sampling of the type of content you'll find in my online classes. The advantage of the online classes is that they are a little more condensed. I edit out all the long pauses, and So, and they're a lot more structured and targeted. We progress from through the lessons in a focused way, and just looking at the different elements that come together to make a painting work and build those skills and technique. So I do have 2 floral courses. Color Drenched Florals and Watercolor is my master course. It's my larger of the courses, and we go over a bunch of different techniques. And the other one is Lovely Loose Florals and Watercolor, which was kind of a mini course dedicated to just painting loosely, very similar to what we did here in the last few weeks. And I wanted to also, what I'm going to do is, now that we've wrapped up this floral series, is I will be packaging these lessons, tucking them in as a bonus into that Color Drenched Floral. So if you want to watch these over again, they're only available on YouTube for the week after they broadcast, but they will be available on my online site. So keep that in mind. Taking a look again, just moving on to questions. Lynette asks if I ever use pen and ink with my watercolors. I actually did just last week. I have so many art supplies, and I don't use it very often because I really feel much more comfortable with a brush in my hand. But I am starting to incorporate a little bit of ink and line into some of my paintings, just as I feel they need it. I do have, Mary asks, what does it mean that a color is permanent? I'm not a color scientist. I'm not very academic about color. I believe that rose madder permanent, meaning that it is more light fast than the original rose madder, but I would have to, don't quote me on that because I'm not 100% sure. Appreciate everyone stopping by today. We are already 40 minutes in here, and so I need to wrap this up. I want to thank you for joining me. Please do subscribe to my channel, join my mailing list. These are ways that you can keep the learning going and stay encouraged, because it's really important to me to help you understand, help you replace the negative self-talk that we all kind of do. We're so critical of our own art and doubtful that we have the ability to paint the way we want. So I really want to encourage you. I've been doing this for 20 plus years, and what I've learned in that, the biggest thing I've learned in that is just to trust the process and have faith, because you will get there. It's really not nearly as much a matter of having a gift as it is of just not giving up. As well, like I said earlier, please do consider if you can join me in Dawson Creek. I'd love to have you here in my studio for my 2-day workshop in July. And watch my site for more announcements about workshops. I'm hoping to be in Vancouver in November, and I've got some great plans coming up for 2018 as well, which I'll be sharing as soon as they're finalized. Thank you for joining me. Have a really good day, and find some time to paint. You won't regret it.